Thank you, Rhonda. In honor of the first week back to school, I thought it was only fitting that I should welcome you to Bible 101. The first part of the Bible goes to roughly about there. What do we call this first part of the Bible?
Old Testament.
The Old Testament. Very good. Because it's older. It's about 2/3 of the Bible, about 3/4. We're pretty creative in the church, the Old Testament. What do we call this slim little section here at the back of the book?
New Testament.
The New Testament. Very good. Now, the Old Testament, I'll start there, is basically everything from creation up until a few centuries before Christ. The New Testament starts roughly with Jesus' birth and goes to his death and resurrection, his ascension, and then some travels of Paul and a few other letters. And essentially that is the New Testament. It covers roughly about 50 years, give or take. Now, okay. I saw these legs underneath the pew. That's different. All right. I thought he was growing up for you. But anyhow, the Old Testament, at my old church, my previous church, whenever I would preach on the Old Testament for 2 or 3 Sundays in a row, I had a wonderful woman in the church. She loved my sermons, she loved my family, she was a great supporter, but whenever I preached on the Old Testament for 2 or 3 Sundays in a row, I would hear about it. Do we have to do the Old Testament again? I want to hear about Jesus. I want to hear the New Testament. I want to hear that. I want to hear the gospel. And I understand that. But I tried to explain to her, 3/4 of the Bible is the Old Testament. There's a lot of stuff in there. And there's wonderful stories. There are stories about creation, and there's stories about giant fish swallowing people, and there's stories about strong men killing lions, and there's battles, and there's all this giants. I mean, there's great stuff in the Old Testament. Still not convinced. I said, but if you really want to understand Jesus, and where Jesus is coming from, you really need to read the Old Testament, because the Old Testament was Jesus' scriptures. That was where Jesus preached from. The Old Testament was Jesus' Bible. Yeah, but can we still hear the New Testament? I'm not sure I ever convinced you, but I continue to preach the Old Testament because I do believe it is very important. And we need to hear those stories, and they are great stories. But before I get into our scripture passage for today, I want to tell you a story from Norman Vincent Peale. I'll call him Dr. Peale because it's just easier. 2 first names, I get them confused. Vincent Norman or Norman Vincent, I get them confused. So Dr. Peale. Dr. Peale had a good friend. And this friend had lost a leg and had his leg amputated a few years before. And he was now back in the hospital, and they were going to remove the other leg. Dr. Peale was really not looking forward to this hospital visit. This was a good friend of his. And in that kind of situation, you never really know what you're walking into. It can be hard. But he felt he needed to go, and so he went. He got to the hospital and he thought, well, I'll check in with the nurses and the doctors and see how things are going first before I go see my friend. So he walks in up to the nurse's station, he tells them who he is and says who's there to visit. And they said, is your friend all right? He's like, what do you mean? They said, he's the happiest guy in this hospital. Given the situation, what he's facing, you would think he would be very, very different. But he's happier than the nurses, he's happier than the doctors, he's just the happiest guy in this hospital. Are you sure he's okay? upstairs. I said, well, he's always been fine before, but I'll go check on him. So Dr. Peel went to his friend's room, knocked on his door, they exchanged pleasantries as you always do, shook hands, whatever. And then Dr. Peel asked him, are you okay? And the man said, I'm fine, I'm great, I feel good, I'm just as happy as can be. And Dr. Peel said, well, that's what I've been hearing. The nurses and doctors are kind of concerned about you. They said, you know, normally most people in your situation are not going to be so upbeat. Are you really okay? And the man said, yeah, I'm fine. I'm doing great. I'm happy to be alive. I'm happy to just be here and be with you, talking. It's great. He said, you've got to be putting me on. You're putting on an act. You're putting, surely that's not how you really feel. And I said, yes, I do. I really feel that way. So Dr. Peel said, well, tell me, what's your secret? How is it that you're keeping so upbeat, so happy, that everything, you know, facing what you're facing, how can you be so upbeat? My secret? Well, it's right over there on the table. Dr. Peel looked over there, not really knowing what to expect, and there he saw the man's Bible. And the man said, whenever I start feeling down, depressed, whenever I start feeling sorry for myself, I go to that little book over there and I start reading. And I keep reading, and pretty soon I start feeling a little bit better. And I start feeling good. And I start feeling happy because of what God has done. There's a peace that comes over me and just a joy that no one can take away. And one has to wonder, was he reading Isaiah? I mean, think about it. Last week we started in Isaiah chapter 1, and it was all about justice and mercy and how the people were not behaving and were not doing. Now we're in chapter 5, and it's still going on about justice and mercy. Surely the man was not reading from Isaiah the first few chapters. Enough of that already. And Isaiah even says this is a love song. You kind of have to wonder about Isaiah's mental capacities. I wonder, you know, if this is his idea of a love song, did he ever have a second date? Good, you laughed. I wasn't sure how that would go over. But this is Isaiah. I mean, he goes on and on about this justice and mercy, and enough already. How can this be uplifting and joyous? How can this be uplifting and joyous? I would much rather read from Psalms. Psalms 80, which tells a very similar story. If you're ever looking for Psalms in the Bible, just open about halfway through. It'll take you almost always to Psalms, and then look up 80. I'll read it to you. It's a very similar story to what we read in Isaiah. I'll start at the 8th verse. You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it. It took root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. It sent out its branches to the sea and its shoots to the river. Why then have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass along the way pluck its fruit? The boar from the forest ravages it, and all that move in the field feed on it. Turn again, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven and see. Have regard for this vine, the stock that your right hand planted. They have burned it with fire. They have cut it down. May they perish at the rebuke of your countenance. But let your hand be upon the one at your right hand, the one whom you made strong for yourself. Then we will never turn back from you. Give us life, and we will call on your name. Restore us, O Lord God of hosts. Let your face shine, and may we be saved. Now, isn't that just a lot more, that has a lot more gusto than Isaiah. And yet, we're reading Isaiah. More Isaiah. Why? Why? Why would the stories that are so similar be so different? Maybe, perhaps, possibly, it's because God was speaking to different people at different times. The Psalms were written by David when Israel was reaching its peak. Things were going well. Now, yeah, they'd had some difficulties, and David said, "Why have you forsaken us? And you built this wall? Why? But God, if we have faith, you'll come and you will protect us again. We know." Well, things were good during David's time. If you know the history, Moses brought the people of Israel out of Egypt. They wandered in the desert, but then God established them in the promised land. Therefore, roughly 400 years, they had judges who ruled over. Now, ruling is a bad word. They were very loosely connected. When enemies came, God would call a judge to come and lead them and kick the enemies out, and things would go back to being rather loosely coordinated. But after so many years, they said, "God, give us a king. We want to be like our neighbors. Give us a king." God said, "It's a bad idea. You're not going to like it. They're going to tax you. You're going to have all sorts of things you do." But they said, "Give us a king." So God gave them a king. Gave him King Saul. King Saul started to consolidate power. And then King Saul did something God didn't like, so God deposed him and put David on the throne. And David consolidated more power. The empire grew. The kingdom grew. They had power. They had influence from Egypt to the Euphrates. I mean, they were becoming a world power at the time. Things were good. Enemies would come and attack. David would write his songs. But God was on their side and they knew it. Isaiah was writing for a very different time. Because after David was a good man. He was a good king. But he made his mistakes too. He had a son named Solomon. Solomon was the son of David and Bathsheba. Some of you probably know that story. And Solomon took the throne. There was some people not so happy about that, but Solomon was a fairly good king, rich and powerful. The kingdom continued to grow. But Solomon fell away towards the end. He had, I don't know, something like 800 wives. And he was extremely wealthy. And some of the wives were trying to teach him other ways. And so the kingdom after Solomon split into north and south. The northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And not all of the kings were good. In fact, a lot of them were pretty bad. And they started to allow worship of other gods. And they started to allow things that God did not appreciate. Things were going downhill. This was the time when Isaiah was writing. And Isaiah needed to get their attention. Look around you at what we're doing. And so chapter after chapter after chapter, Isaiah starts hitting them with this notion of justice and mercy. Look, see what we're doing to ourselves. Now Isaiah puts it in the form of a love song or in the form of a poem. God has planted the vine. It's Israel. God brought us out of Egypt and planted us here and took care of us. Look at what God has done. But because we have fallen away, because we have left the path that God planned for us, God is going to take away the walls of protection. The enemies are going to start coming in. The garden is not going to be tended. Thistles and brambles are going to start growing up, and it's not going away. God planted good grapes, good vines, and He's giving sour wine. He planted good vines, good grapes, and He's giving the grapes of wrath, the grapes of anger and blood. This is not what God intended. And so you have two similar stories, one from Psalm, one from Isaiah, telling very similar things about a vine. So is God trying to say different things? Was God confused? Like maybe you're a little bit confused right now. Is there a different, am I preaching two different messages here this morning? Am I confused? It wouldn't be the first time. It wouldn't be the first time. But there is a unifying message here. And it's one that we need to hear. C.T. Studd, it's his real name. C.T. Studd was a British missionary during the 1800s, mid to late 1800s. And it was a rather famous fellow. He found himself on a boat to China. He was going to be a missionary in China. He didn't, in those days, get on an airplane and fly there in one day. That's just not how it worked. You took a rather slow boat until you finally got there. Well, C.T. Studd, as luck would have it, got on a boat that was captained by an old sea salt that hated Christianity. In fact, he relished making fun of missionaries that rode on his boat. And he studied the Bible religiously. He knew it better than probably me. Or probably a lot better than me. I wish I knew it better. But he studied it night and day. So he could argue with these missionaries and prove that Christianity was a bunch of bunk. Well, when he found out that C.T. Studd, this famous missionary, was on his boat, oh, he was ready. He went up to him and he started yelling at him and lambasting him and railing against him and proving from the Bible that Christianity was a bunch of jokes. It was a joke. He was a joke. C.T. Studd just stood there, didn't say a word. He didn't say a word. He let the man rail. He let the man yell and scream and say all sorts of nasty things. He let him blow himself out. And when he was all done, he went up to him, put his arm around him and said, you know, I have the peace that passes all understanding. And I have a joy in my heart that no one can take away. The old sea captain pulled away from him, glared at him for a little bit, and he said, you're a lucky duck. And he walked away. By the end of the voyage, that old sea captain was a professing Christian. You can take the Bible, and if you're selective, and pick your verses, which a lot of people today do, you can make it say pretty much whatever you want it to say, and you can prove almost any point that you want it to prove. But that's not how the Bible was intended to be used. That was not the meaning. It's a book of faith. It's a book of faith that you have to open, that you have to read, and that you have to open your heart and your mind to, and let God speak into your heart. That's how the Bible was meant to be read. Look. For the people that David was speaking to, God was close. God had been on their side. They felt God's presence. They knew God had turned away because they had messed up. But God, come back. We will follow you. And it was immediate and right away. God spoke to them in their need at their time. And they heard the words that gave them peace and joy in their situation. Isaiah came along later. It was a darker time. It was a harder time. Enemies were pushing in from without. There were enemies within. Things were not looking good. And so Isaiah is speaking to them where they are. God is speaking to those people. And what they needed was a message from God saying, love one another. Have compassion, have mercy, and have justice. And he repeated it over and over because that is what they needed to hear. That is what the people needed to hear. And it gave them a peace and a joy in their heart. The Bible does not say that if you believe in God, your whole life will be rosy. In fact, a lot of difficulties come. But God will always be there. There are places in the Bible which, frankly, I'll be honest with you, I don't like to read. I have often suggested Leviticus as a cure for insomnia. All the rules, all the law codes, I mean, page after page, chapter after chapter of rules and laws, and oh my goodness, can this ever end? But think about the people to whom God was speaking. These were people who had come out of Egypt, and they knew no law. The law that they had known in Egypt was gone. They were living in lawlessness, and God was here giving them a law that they could live their lives by, that brought peace, comfort, and joy. That's what the law code really does. To a people living without law in lawlessness, the law code that we find so boring today, it brought them comfort. The Bible, when you open it and read, and instead of like an old sea captain reading it to try to prove other people wrong, but when you start seeing what it can do in somebody else's life, and you start reading and thinking, maybe it might be able to do something in my life too. It can even change an old sea captain. As hard and crusty as he may have been, when he started reading it for how God could enter in and opened himself up to those words, he became a Christian. And back to Dr. Peel's good friend in the hospital, lying there thinking about what was about to happen. It could not have been easy. But because he opened himself up to those words, to God's words in his life, he could find peace. He could find a peace that passes all understanding. And he could find a joy. A joy lying there in the hospital, knowing that he was soon to be a paraplegic. But he could find joy that no one could take away. That's the power of God's Word. That's the power of that little book sitting there. Open it. Let God pour God's words into your life. Let God give you the peace. Let God give you the joy that only God and His Son, Jesus Christ, can bring. That's my prayer. I'm preaching to myself as well as to you. I need to do it more.